Mirae had chosen the dress herself. That was the detail she kept returning to, standing at the entrance of the Hanwha Grand Ceremonial Hall with 200 guests arranged in white chairs before her and the smell of gardenias so thick in the air it felt like breathing something solid. She had chosen the dress herself, which meant she could not blame anyone else for the way it fit, for the way the ivory silk moved against her when she walked, for the small and private pleasure she had taken, standing in front of the fitting room mirror 3 weeks ago, in thinking that she looked, for once, like someone who belonged in a beautiful thing. She had allowed herself that. She had stood in that mirror and she had thought, this is enough. This is what enough looks like. And then she had folded the thought away, carefully, the way she folded all thoughts that bordered on wanting something, because wanting things had never served her particularly well, and she had learned over the course of 27 years to keep her expectations at a level that disappointment could not reach. She had not managed it completely. She had still wanted the dress. She was wearing it now. The hall was everything that the wedding planner had promised and everything that Mirae's mother had demanded, which were not always the same list but had converged in this case into something genuinely impressive. White roses climbed the arch at the altar in practiced cascades. Crystal pendants caught the morning light from the tall windows and broke it into small scattered brightness across the walls and the faces of the guests, across the white chairs and the white ribbon and the white everything. Because Mirae's mother had an opinion about color at weddings, and that opinion was that there should not be any. The string quartet in the corner played something classical and expensive. Mirae did not know the piece. She had not been consulted about the music. She had not been consulted about very much when it came to this wedding. She had chosen the dress, and she had been permitted to select the flavor of the inner layer of the cake, which was raspberry, which Dohyun had then overridden in favor of vanilla because he felt raspberry was too informal for an event of this caliber. She had not argued. She had learned over the 14 months of their engagement that arguing with Dohyun about small things was a transaction with a very unfavorable exchange rate, that it cost more than it returned, that the energy spent was better conserved for the moments that mattered. She was still waiting for a moment that mattered. She suspected, in the quieter hours, that she had been waiting for one her entire life. She walked down the aisle. Her father's arm was under her hand, and she could feel the tension in it, the particular quality of a man holding himself together through the force of social obligation alone, present in body and absent in every other sense. He had said this morning while she was having her hair pinned, "You look fine." He had said it looking at his phone. She had said, "Thank you." He had not looked up. This was, she had reflected at the time, a reasonably accurate summary of their relationship, and she had been grateful, in the small and careful way she was grateful for things, that it had at least been present for the occasion. Some absences wore suits and showed up anyway. That counted for something. She was not sure what. The guests turned as she walked. She registered their faces in the peripheral way of someone who has learned not to invest too much in the expressions of people watching her, because expressions at events like this were performances within a performance, carefully arranged to communicate appropriate sentiments that may or may not correspond to anything internal. She saw her mother in the third row, her posture so correct it looked structural, her expression arranged into the specific configuration of contained pride that she reserved for moments when the family was visible to people who mattered. She saw her older sister Ji-yeon beside her, beautiful in a way that had always come easily, in the way of someone for whom beauty was simply one item on a long list of things that came easily, watching Mirae with the polite attention of someone present at an event that did not quite concern them. She saw Jung-hyun's family filling the right side of the hall with the comfortable self-possession of people who owned the kinds of rooms they sat in, who had never walked into a space and wondered whether they were welcome. She saw, in the third row on the left, a man she did not recognize. He was not difficult to see. He was the kind of person who was not difficult to see even in rooms designed to draw the eye elsewhere, even in a hall dressed in white roses and crystal light, even surrounded by 200 people whose collective wealth and influence had been assembled specifically to impress. He sat with a stillness that was not the stillness of someone waiting for something to begin, but the stillness of someone for whom the proceedings were simply part of the air, something that existed around him without requiring his participation. He was in a dark suit that absorbed the crystal light rather than catching it. His face was composed and unreadable, and oriented toward the altar, and he did not turn to watch her walk the aisle the way the rest of the room had turned. And this was, Mirae recognized with some distant and analytical part of herself, more noticeable than if he had. He was not watching her arrive, he was watching the altar. He was watching Jung Hyun. She reached the altar. Her father transferred her hand to Jung Hyun's with the quiet efficiency of a man completing an administrative task, and then stepped back, and she was standing in front of the man she was going to marry, in the dress she had chosen herself, in the hall she had not been consulted about, with the raspberry layer replaced by vanilla. And she looked at Jung Hyun's face and thought, this is enough. This is what enough looks like. She did not believe it this time. Jung Hyun was handsome in the way that men who have always been told they are handsome become handsome, through repetition and expectation, through the world confirming the impression so consistently that the impression became structural. He was 31 and the son of Chairman Jung of the Daesung Development Group, and he wore his suit with the ease of someone who had never had to consider whether he could afford it. He looked at Mirae now, at the altar, in front of 200 people and the string quartet and the white roses, and his expression was doing something that she could not immediately interpret, something that moved through several configurations in rapid succession, none of which settled into anything she recognized as warmth. The officiant began. The ceremonial language filled the hall, the formal phrasing of union and commitment, of two lives becoming one trajectory, of the legal and symbolic and social architecture of marriage being constructed in real time through the medium of spoken words and witnessed intention. Mirae listened. She kept her expression arranged in the appropriate configuration. She held Jung Hyun's hands and felt the particular quality of his grip, which was not quite absent, but was not quite present either, was the grip of a man going through a necessary sequence of actions, rather than a man holding the hands of someone he intended to keep. She had known this. She had known it for a long time. She had learned to know it the way you learn to know things that are true and inconvenient, gradually and without ceremony, through the accumulation of small evidences that each individually could be explained away, and collectively could not. The way he spoke about her to his colleagues, correctively, as if she required constant context. The way he had introduced her to his mother, efficiently, as if completing a requirement. The way he had never once, in 14 months of engagement, asked her what she wanted, not from the wedding or from the marriage or from the life that was being constructed around her like a building whose floor plan she had not approved and whose exits she had not located. She had told herself these were not the things that mattered. She had told herself that stability was more important than warmth, that security was worth more than desire, that she was not a woman who had earned the luxury of wanting the things that other women wanted. She had believed this almost completely. She was standing at the altar believing it almost completely right now. The officiant reached the vows. Jung Hyun's hands released hers. It was such a small thing. Hands releasing. The mechanical opening of fingers, the withdrawal of contact, a thing that happens 100 times a day without significance, but it happened here, now, at this specific moment, with the weight of the ritual around them and the 200 witnesses and the gardenias so thick in the air she could taste them, and it happened with a quality of deliberateness that made her very still inside. Her hands remained where they were, suspended in the space where his had been, for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. She lowered them to her sides. She looked at his face. He was looking at the floor. The officiant paused. The string quartet played 2 more bars, and then, with the sensitivity of professionals who understood that something was happening, faded to silence. Jung Hyun raised his head. He looked at Mirae, and his expression had finally settled into something she could read, which was a relief and also the worst thing she had ever seen on a human face, because what it was resolved. It was the expression of a man who has made a decision and has moved past the making of it into the territory of implementation. It was the expression of someone who was no longer uncertain, which would have been reassuring in any other context, and in this one was a form of devastation. He was still holding the microphone. The hall was designed for acoustics. Every word would carry. "I need to say something," he said. The silence that followed had a texture to it. The particular silence of 200 people collectively suspending respiration, of a room understanding that it is witnessing something that was not on the program, that the event has departed from its schedule in a direction that the schedule could not have anticipated, and that everyone present is now going to be implicated in, is going to carry home with them, is going to describe to people who were not here for the rest of the foreseeable future. Mirae stood in this silence. She felt it against her skin. She felt the dress, the ivory silk she had chosen herself, the dress in which she had thought for one unguarded moment in a fitting room mirror that she looked like someone who belonged in beautiful things, and she waited. "She has never been what I wanted," Dohyun said. His voice was measured, which was worse than if it had been emotional. Emotion implies conflict. Measurement implies conclusion. "My family wanted this match. There were considerations, business ones, and I respected those considerations, and I agreed to this arrangement because I understand the value of family obligation. But I want to be honest, and I think she deserves honesty, which is that I have spent 14 months trying to feel something that I don't feel, and I cannot stand here and make promises I already know I will not be able to keep. She is not the wrong woman. She is simply not my woman, and I think we both know that. I think she has always known that." The silence after was a different kind, fuller, heavier. The kind of silence that is made of things people are not saying, of 200 people sitting with something they have just witnessed and processing the weight of it and arriving, each of them, at their own private understanding of what had just been done to the woman standing at the altar in the ivory dress. Mirae did not move. She had a long history with the experience of being told, in various formulations and with various degrees of directness, that she was not quite enough, not quite right, not quite the thing that the situation required. She had received this information from her mother in the form of small and consistent corrections that were framed as guidance but functioned as a continuous documentation of her inadequacy. She had received it from Ji-yun in the form of comparisons so habitual they had long since stopped needing to be stated directly, had become instead a kind of ambient condition, something you live inside without requiring anyone to explain it. She had received it from teachers who lost interest, from colleagues who forgot her name, from Dohyun himself in the 14 months of an engagement that had always felt like something he was completing rather than something he was choosing. She was familiar with the substance of what had just been said to her. She had been receiving its essential message for 27 years. What she was not familiar with was the scale of the delivery, the microphone, the 200 witnesses, the white roses and the crystal light, and the string quartet sitting with their instruments lowered, watching. The particular quality of a public humiliation that had been inflicted not in a private room or in a corridor or in the small and personal spaces where cruelty usually operated, but here, in a hall designed to be witnessed, at a moment designed to be remembered, in a dress she had chosen herself. She did not cry. She was not going to cry here, in front of these people, in this dress, with her mother in the third row and her sister watching with the politely detached interest of someone viewing an event that did not concern her. She was not going to give this moment that. She was not going to let it have her tears, because tears were the last private thing she had, and she was not going to surrender them to a hall full of people who would carry the image home with them and describe it to other people and reduce her to the story of a woman who cried at her own abandoned wedding. She breathed. She kept her spine straight. She looked at Dohyun's face and felt something that was not anger, not yet, something quieter and more fundamental.
the sensation of a door closing in a house she had not chosen to live in, the recognition that the key was being taken from her hand, and underneath that, underneath all of it, the thing she had not expected, the faint and shameful flicker of something that was almost relief. She was still standing in that flicker, still processing its implications, when she heard the sound of a chair. It was a small sound, the controlled movement of furniture, a single chair, someone rising. It came from the third row on the left. She knew, before she looked, who it was. She had registered him walking in, had noted the particular quality of his stillness, and something in her, some instrument she did not know she possessed, had been tracking him the way a compass tracks north, not because she had chosen to, but because the instrument did not consult her preferences. She looked. He was standing. He stood the way he had sat, with the quality of someone for whom the physical position of the body is simply an extension of an interior decision, something chosen rather than assumed. He was tall in the way that some men are tall as a form of argument, as if height were a position being staked rather than a measurement being recorded. The dark suit contained him without diminishing him, the way good things contain what they are made for. His face, which she could see clearly now that he had risen and oriented himself, was not a young face, and was not trying to be. It was a face that had been through its education and had retained the record of it without apology, a face with the particular authority of something that had been tested and had declined to break. He was looking at Jung-hyun with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion and is not in a hurry to announce it, because he is not required to be in a hurry for anything. He moved. The row parted for him with the instinctive accommodation of people who understand, on some level below articulation, that certain forces require passage. He walked up the aisle the way someone walks through their own building, without performance, without the slight adjustment of posture that people make when they are aware of being watched, without any acknowledgement that 200 people had pivoted in their chairs to watch him move. He reached the altar in a silence so complete that she could hear the slight sound his shoes made against the marble floor, measured and unhurried. And then he stopped. He stood beside her.
He looked at Jung-hyun. He did not speak immediately. He had the quality of a man who understood that silence, deployed correctly, was a more effective instrument than language, that the weight of what you did not say could be felt more completely than the weight of what you did, and he deployed it now with the precision of someone who had used it many times and knew exactly how long to let it sit before the pressure became sufficient. Jung-hyun's face had changed. The resolved, measured expression was gone. What had replaced it was something that Mirae recognized as the specific physiological response to suddenly understanding that you had made a miscalculation in a context where miscalculations have consequences. The particular pallor and stillness of a man recalibrating his situation rapidly and finding the new numbers unfavorable. Shin Dohyun, the standing man said. He offered the name the way one offers a piece of information that the other person already has and has simply been hoping would not need to be acknowledged. He said it quietly, which made it louder than anything that had been said in the hall before it. Jung-hyun said nothing. His throat moved. "You have just declined something in front of me," Shin Dohyun said. His voice had a quality that Mirae could not immediately categorize, low and precisely controlled, and carrying the kind of authority that did not come from volume or aggression, but from the absolute conviction of a man who had never said anything he did not mean and had no intention of beginning. He was not speaking to the hall, he was speaking to Jung-hyun, but the hall was receiving every word with the stillness of 200 people who understood that they were witnessing something and that the responsible thing to do was to witness it without interruption. "I watched you decline it. I want you to understand what that means." He turned. He turned to Mirae, and the attention that had been directed at Jung-hyun shifted now to her face, and it hit her the way she imagines a current hits you when you step into water that is moving, not violently, but with the absolute certainty of something that has been in motion long before you arrived. His eyes were dark and clear, and looked at her with a directness that she was not accustomed to receiving.
not the directness of someone assessing her for a purpose, not the directness of someone who needed something from her, but the directness of someone who was simply seeing her, which was a thing that had been done to her so rarely and with such insufficient frequency that she was not entirely sure she was reading it correctly. "You are not required to stay here," he said. His voice was quieter now, pitched for her specifically, and the shift in volume was a kind of gift, a removal of the public dimension, a construction of a small private space in the middle of all this witnessed theater. He said it simply, without inflection, as a statement of fact, as if he were telling her something about the physical world, that the doors were there, that the exit existed, that she possessed the capacity for movement and choice, and that no architecture in this building was capable of overriding it. She looked at him. Her hands were still at her sides. She was aware of the 200 people, of her mother in the third row, of Ji-yeon's politely detached attention, of Jung-hyun standing 3 feet away with that new expression, of the gardenias and the crystal light and the white roses and the string quartet with their instruments lowered and the vanilla cake in the anteroom that had been raspberry until it was overridden. She was aware of all of it the way you are aware of weather, as something existing around you. And she was aware of this man in a completely different way, the way you are aware of something that is directed at you specifically, something that has found you and is making itself known. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any reason to expect. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but something in the same family. Something that lived at the edge of it and suggested that the full thing existed somewhere and was occasionally permitted. He said, "Someone who knows what was just thrown away." Before she could answer, before she could decide what to do with the heat that had begun at the back of her neck and was spreading with the specific patience of something that intended to take its time, her mother's voice arrived. Her mother had risen from the third row. She was moving toward the altar with the controlled urgency of a woman managing a crisis that had materialized in public, wearing the expression of someone doing rapid and continuous calculations about reputation and damage and the opinions of the 200 people currently watching and how this moment would be absorbed and retold and what version of it could be salvaged from the wreckage if the right choices were made immediately. "Mirae," she said, and her voice carried the particular frequency that Mirae had spent her life responding to, the frequency that said, "What you are about to do matters less than how it will appear." "Leave it," said Shin Dohyun. He did not look at her mother. He continued looking at Mirae, and his voice carried the same quiet authority, except that it now also carried the additional weight of a man who was not accustomed to saying things twice. Her mother stopped. This was also notable. Her mother was not a woman who stopped for other people's voices. She stopped for Shin Dohyun's, and in stopping, communicated something that Mirae filed away, something about who this man was, about the radius of the silence he carried with him, about what it meant that even her mother, who had never in Mirae's memory conceded anything to anyone, had assessed the situation and elected to be still. Before you continue reading, if this story is finding something in you right now, press like on this video. Tell me in the comments what you felt when he stood up. And if you are not subscribed yet, subscribe now because the next story is already written and you will not want to arrive late. Jung-hyun's father had materialized near the altar. He was a heavy-set man with the compressed authority of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in most rooms he entered, and he was wearing the expression of a man who had just watched an 8-figure social and business arrangement detonate in real time and was attempting, with whatever resources remained, to manage the blast radius. "Shinsi," he said, using the formal address with the careful deference of a man who understood the hierarchy he was addressing. "Surely there is no need for any disruption. This is a family matter, a private moment, and I am certain that my son simply—" He paused, choosing words with the visible effort of someone building something structurally load-bearing under time pressure, spoke out of nerves. "Young men say things at altars. It means nothing." Shin Dohyun turned to look at him. The slowness of the turn was its own communication. He said it meant something to her. He said it without emotion and without aggression, as a correction, a simple and complete correction, and the accuracy of it landed in the hall with the finality of something placed rather than thrown. Jung Hyun's father closed his mouth. Jung Hyun was still standing at the altar. He had not moved since Shin Dohyun arrived beside Mirae, had remained in the position of a man who had delivered a verdict and discovered, too late, that the verdict had been received by parties he had not anticipated. He looked, Mirae thought, like someone who had opened a door expecting a particular room and found instead an entirely different architecture, one with different rules and different dimensions and different inhabitants, and who was now standing in the threshold, trying to determine whether he could still navigate back to the life he had been planning to return to.
He could not. She could see this, and he could see this, and the 200 people watching could see this, and the seeing of it, the collective and public witness to the irreversibility of what had been done, was a kind of justice that she had not asked for and had not expected, and was not sure she deserved, but was receiving anyway. Jiyeon's voice came from the third row. Of course she would speak. Jiyeon always spoke at the moments when speaking was most efficiently damaging, with the gift of the chronically favored for identifying the precise comment that would make a difficult situation into a personal failing. "You are causing a scene," she said. She directed this at Mirae with the particular tone of an older sister who has spent a lifetime being the easier child and is tired of the harder one requiring attention at inconvenient times. "You always do this. You always make things more complicated than they need to be. Just apologize, get through the ceremony, and we can all deal with the rest later." Mirae looked at her sister. She looked at her for a longer time than she usually allowed herself to look at Jiyeon, because usually looking at Jiyeon for too long activated the comparison mechanism that she had been trying to dismantle for 27 years, the internal accounting of all the ways she measured differently against that particular standard. But she looked now, and she felt something that surprised her, which was not the familiar diminishment, but something closer to clarity, the sensation of seeing a thing accurately for the first time, not because the thing had changed, but because she had moved to a position from which its actual dimensions were visible. Jiyeon was beautiful and capable and accustomed to the world organizing itself around her preferences, and she was also, in this moment, telling her younger sister to apologize for being publicly humiliated at her own wedding, and those two things existed simultaneously, and Mirae did not need to reconcile them. She simply needed to see them clearly. She said nothing to Jiyeon. She turned back to Shin Dohyun. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he had turned on her from the beginning, that complete and non-negotiable regard, and she understood that he had been watching her navigate the last several minutes with her family, had been watching without interfering, had been letting her find her own footing, which was a form of respect that she had received so infrequently it took her a moment to identify it. She said, "I don't know you." He said, "No." She said, "And you stood up anyway." He looked at her in the quiet way he looked at things. Then he said, "I have sat in rooms for 20 years and watched people do things that required someone to stand up, and I did not stand up, because my interests were not involved, and it was not my place." He paused. This was different. "How?" she said. He said, "Because you looked at him when he said it, and you did not look surprised." The accuracy of it moved through her like a sound wave, through the chest and the sternum and the place where the body registers things before the mind catches up. She had not looked surprised. She had not been surprised. She had been absorbing the public confirmation of something she had always privately known, and she had done it with the practiced efficiency of a woman for whom the absorption of disappointment had become a fluency. And he had watched her do it, and apparently it had been sufficient to move him from his chair. She breathed. The gardenias were still thick in the air. The crystal light still broke across the walls. The roses were still climbing the altar arch in their practiced cascades. Everything was as it had been when she walked in, except that it was completely different. She said, "If I leave with you, I don't know what I'm walking into." He said, "You know what you're walking out of." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's not an answer." "No,"
he said, and the edge of the almost smile was there again, brief and deliberate. "It's an observation. The answer is that I will tell you everything you want to know, and I will not tell you anything I do not intend to be true, and you will be able to make a decision with complete information. That is what I can offer you right now." She thought about complete information. She thought about what it would mean to be given that, to have the full text of a situation presented without the redactions she had learned to expect, without the omissions that had shaped her understanding of her own life into something smaller and more manageable than its actual dimensions. She thought about 14 months of being managed, of being the vanilla choice, of being the acceptable arrangement rather than the actual want. She thought about 27 years of the same lesson delivered in different classrooms. She reached up and unclipped the veil. She held it for a moment, the white fabric, the small, delicate clip that had been pinned in her hair by a stylist she had not chosen for an event she had not truly been invited to participate in, and then she set it on the altar. She set it down with the same deliberateness with which you set down something you have been carrying for a long time, something that has been understood until this moment to be simply part of what you were carrying, not optional, not something you could simply put on a surface and walk away from. She put it on the surface. She stepped back from the altar. She walked with him out of the hall. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked the way she had walked down the aisle toward a wedding she had trained herself to be grateful for, with her spine straight and her expression composed, except that this time the composure was not the armor she wore to survive other people's witnessing of her diminishment. This time it was simply the posture of a woman walking toward something, and the something was unknown, and the unknown did not feel like a threat. It felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it might be the correct direction. They emerged into the corridor outside the hall. The doors closed behind them, and the sound of 200 people resuming breath was muffled and then gone. The corridor was marble and cool and quiet in the specific way of places designed for transactions of significance, and she stood in it beside a man she had seen for the first time 20 minutes ago and felt the strange and particular quality of the air around him, the calm that he carried the way some people carry certainty as a condition rather than a performance. "Your name," he said, the same low, precise voice. He had not asked in the hall. He was asking now. "Mirae," she said. He looked at her with the directness that she was still learning how to receive without looking away. "Shin Dohyun," he said, and then, after a pause that was brief and measured and carried something in it that she could not yet fully decode, "If you want to know who I am, I will tell you, all of it, and then you can decide." She said, "All of it?" He said, "Yes." She looked at his face. The corridor light was different from the hall, cooler, less ceremonial, less staged. In it, his face was simply what it was, without the architecture of the occasion softening or dramatizing it. It was the face of someone who had made decisions and lived inside them, who did not require the world to validate the decisions in order to continue living inside them, who had arrived at some private sufficiency that did not depend on external measurement. She did not fully understand it yet. She thought she might, eventually. She said, "Then tell me." He told her. They stood in the corridor outside the hall where 200 people were processing the event they had just witnessed, and he spoke with the same quality of voice and the same quality of attention and the same absence of omission that he had promised, and she listened with the full of herself, which was something she had rarely been asked for and had not known until this moment that she was capable of giving. He told her about the Heukgang organization, about what it was and what it did and what it required and what it cost. He told her about the years it had taken to build and the things that had been lost in the building of it. He told her about her father,
about the loan that had been taken 6 years ago, about the debt that had been quietly managed, about the fact that the introduction to Jung Hyun had been, at least in part, a maneuver to move her away from a social proximity that her father had feared for reasons that Shin Dohyun had not fully understood at the time and had come to understand later. She was very still when he finished. The corridor held the silence with them. She said, "My father arranged this, the whole thing, not just to manage his debt, but to keep me away from you specifically." He said, "Yes." She said, "Which means he knew we would meet." He said, "He suspected it was possible. He had reason to." She felt the shape of that. The 6 years of managed distance, the 14 months of a careful engagement to a man who had never wanted her, the vanilla cake, the overridden preferences, the wedding that had never been hers in any real sense. She felt the shape of it, and she felt something beneath the shape, something that was not betrayal exactly, because betrayal required an expectation of better, and she had spent so long expecting so little from her father that the revelation carried more of the texture of confirmation than of rupture. What she felt more precisely was tired, the particular tiredness of a woman who has spent her life being managed by people who told themselves they were protecting her. She said, "And you knew about the loan. You knew about the arrangement with Jung Hyun's family. You knew all of it." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you still came today." He looked at her. He said, "I have known for 6 years that your father was afraid of what would happen if we met, and for 6 years I respected the distance, because the distance was not mine to close. Today you walked into a room where I was sitting. Today, a man stood at an altar and reduced you in front of 200 people with the specific ease of someone who had been doing a smaller version of it for 14 months. And I could see it in how you stood, in how you absorbed it, in the absence of surprise in your face. That is not a distance I can maintain." She said, "Because you felt sorry for me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No." He said it the way he said everything, with the weight of complete conviction behind it, as if the word were a surface you could stand on. He said, "I have felt many things about the situation you were in. Sorry is not among them. I felt respect, which is a different thing entirely. I felt, when you set the veil on the altar and walked away from it, a recognition." He paused. "You do not remind me of weakness. You remind me of someone who has been carrying weight that was never assigned to her and has done it so long she stopped knowing it did not have to be hers. That is not something I feel sorry for. That is something I want to be part of changing." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that same complete and non-negotiable attention, the attention that did not wander, did not take inventory and move on, did not communicate that she was a temporary object of focus in a consciousness moving through a long list of more important concerns. She had spent 27 years being looked at that way, with the consciousness moving past her quality, the glancing attention of people for whom she was a peripheral item, and she had grown so accustomed to it that she had stopped identifying it as a thing that was being done to her and had simply assumed it was the correct proportion of attention for someone like her to receive. This was not that. She said, "I need to know one thing." He said, "Yes."
She said, "If my father's debt is the reason you are here, if I am a transaction in any part of what you are offering, I need you to tell me now, before anything else, before I decide anything, because I have been a transaction for a very long time, and I am finished with it." He was quiet. She had the sense, watching him, that he was not searching for the right words so much as he was choosing from several true things and determining which one was the most complete. Then he said, "Your father's debt was settled 2 years ago. He has owed me nothing since then. I am not here because of an obligation. I am here because I sat in the 3rd row and watched a man treat something precious like something disposable, and I have never in my life been able to sit in a room and watch that happen to something I considered precious and do nothing about it." She breathed. The corridor was very quiet. She said, "You consider me precious?" He said, "Yes." She said, "You have spoken to me for 20 minutes. He said, "Some things do not require duration, they require clarity." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about clarity. She thought about what it was to be seen clearly, not managed, not arranged, not reduced to the function she served in other people's narratives, but simply seen, with the full and patient attention of someone who was not in a hurry and was not going to look away. She thought about her whole life, the weight of it, the accumulated smallness of it, the 27 years of making herself manageable and quiet and undemanding, and the ivory dress she had chosen herself, and the one moment in the fitting room mirror when she had thought, for one unguarded second, that she looked like someone who belonged in beautiful things. She said, "I want to belong in beautiful things." She had not meant to say it out loud. It was the kind of thought she kept internal, the kind that went into the folder of things that were folded away. But it came out, and he heard it, and he did not look at her with the slight discomfort of a man who has received an emotional disclosure he did not request. He looked at her with the same expression he had been wearing since he stood up from his chair. He said, "Then let me show you what that looks like." He held out his hand, not reaching for her, not closing the distance between their hands, simply offering his, palm up, with the quality of a man presenting something and leaving the receipt entirely to her. She looked at his hand. She could see that it was not a young man's hand, that it carried the evidence of years in its particular arrangement of strength and small invisible history. She looked at his face. She could see the patience in it, the complete absence of pressure, the willingness to wait for as long as waiting required, which she suspected was a willingness he had cultivated over a long time and for reasons she did not yet know but thought she might eventually. She placed her hand in his. The warmth of his grip was immediate and deliberate, not tight, not possessive, but present, the grip of someone who understood the difference between holding something and containing it. She felt it move through her hand and into her wrist, and through her arm and into the place in her chest where the relief had briefly flickered earlier in the evening, the place she had not understood at the time and understood a little better now, the place that had been waiting, without her permission and without her full knowledge, for exactly this quality of contact.
They walked. The corridor opened into the main lobby of the Hanwha Grand, high-ceilinged and empty in the way that grand spaces are empty during events, with the staff arranged at their stations and the afternoon light coming through the tall windows in long, composed angles. She was still wearing the ivory dress she had chosen herself. She was still wearing the shoes she had picked to go with it, the small and impractical ones that she had allowed herself because they were the right shoes and she had wanted them. She had the sensation, walking through this lobby in these shoes, in this dress with this man, of having arrived somewhere without having been aware of traveling. His car was outside, a dark vehicle with someone in the front seat who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting without needing to know for how long. The door was opened. She paused at the threshold, the cold afternoon air reaching her through the lobby doors. She said, "I still don't know everything." He said, "I know." She said, "You said you would tell me all of it." He said, "I will. We have time." She looked at him. She thought about time. She had spent so much of hers doing what was required of her that she had not spent very much of it at all, had not used it in the way that belongs to people who understand that it is theirs, that it is a resource that can be invested or wasted or saved but cannot be recovered. She thought about all the time she had spent in the margins of other people's choices, waiting for someone to include her, and she thought about the very different quality of the time that had passed in the last 40 minutes, which had been hers in a way that no preceding time she could easily recall had been hers. She got in the car. The city moved past the windows on the way to wherever they were going. The light was changing with the afternoon, the particular gold of late day beginning to collect at the edges of buildings, to pool in the spaces between structures, to make everything look briefly like something worth keeping. She watched it, and she felt Shin Dohyun beside her in the specific way she had been feeling him since the hall, that directional warmth, that presence that did not press but was simply there, consistent and unhurried and entirely real. She said, "Heukgang, that is what they call your organization?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Black River." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said,
Because rivers do not stop. They find the path through things, or they wear the things down until the path exists. They do not require permission to move. She thought about that. She thought about moving without permission, about the particular freedom of a thing that does not require the approval of the landscape it is crossing. She had spent 27 years asking permission, or not asking and not moving, or asking and being declined and staying anyway. She thought about what it would be to move like water. She thought about the dress, about the veil on the altar, about the door of the ceremonial hall closing behind her and the corridor opening ahead. She said, "I have spent my whole life asking permission to take up space." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I watched you walk down that aisle and I could see it, the way you held yourself, the particular quality of someone who has practiced making themselves smaller than they are." He paused. "It is a skill. I understand why you developed it. I am not asking you to immediately abandon it. I am telling you that in my presence you do not need it." She looked at him. He was looking forward, at the city moving past the windscreen, and in the profile she could see the same qualities she had seen in the hall, the jaw, the particular arrangement of a face that had been through its education and retained the record, the mouth in its neutral line that was not cold and not warm, but something honest. She looked at him, and she thought about permission and presence, and the particular miracle of being told, by someone whose word carried weight, that you did not need the armor you had been building your whole life. She said, "That is a significant thing to tell someone." He turned to look at her. He said, "I am aware of that." She said, "And you mean it?" He said, "I do not say things I do not mean." Then, after a pause, "It is not always a comfortable quality in the people who deal with me, but it is consistent."
She thought about consistency. She thought about 14 months of a man who had meant less than he said, and said less than he meant, and had been, throughout, opaque to her in the particular way of people who have decided that you do not require the full text of their intentions. She thought about what it would be to have the full text. She thought about what he had said in the corridor, about complete information, about telling her everything and not telling her anything he did not intend to be true. She said, "Tell me something true, right now. Something small." He thought about it. She watched him think, which was not the visible performance of consideration that some people offer, the furrowed brow and the theatrical pause, but something quieter and more internal, the actual movement of thought behind a face that had learned to remain composed. Then he said, "I did not sleep last night." He said it without explanation, without the context that would make it fully interpretable, and she understood that the absence of context was intentional, that he was offering the fact and leaving the meaning to her. She said, "Because of today." He said, "Yes." She sat with that. He had not slept the night before a day he had walked into as a guest at a wedding that had nothing to do with him, in which he had had no stated role, toward an outcome that had been entirely unplanned. He had not slept, and she could see now, with the attention she was bringing to his face, that this was true, that there was in him the particular quality of someone who had spent the dark hours with something they could not put down, something they had needed to arrive at a decision about, and had arrived. She said, "Were you afraid?" He said, "I was uncertain, which is, for me, close enough." She looked at the city. The gold light was deeper now, moving toward evening, and the buildings were beginning to hold their own light in the windows, the warm internal glow of inhabited spaces, of lives being lived in lit rooms. She had spent a lot of her life looking at lit windows from the outside, the particular observer's relationship to warmth, the knowledge of it without the belonging to it. She thought about belonging. She thought about being inside the lit room, rather than standing on the pavement outside it, looking up. She said, "I do not know how to do this, whatever this is." He said, "Neither do I. Not this version." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her. She said, "That is not reassuring." He said, "I know." He said it with the edge of the almost smile. "But I am telling you the truth, which I promised to do." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was not a practiced smile, not the polite, functional smile she had spent years deploying in rooms where she needed to communicate acceptable sentiment. It was the smile that belonged to her specifically, the one she kept internal, the one she had given to almost no one. She gave it now, and she felt it, felt the unfamiliarity of it on her face in the presence of someone else, felt the vulnerability of letting a true expression be visible. And underneath the vulnerability, quiet and certain as a current, she felt that she was not going to take it back. He looked at her smile. Something changed in his face that she thought she would spend a long time learning to read accurately, something that was not the almost smile, but was more complete than that, something that had been waiting behind the composure for the right occasion. He said, "I told you some things do not require duration, they require clarity." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am very clear about this." She said, "So am I." Months later, when people who had been at the wedding attempted to describe what they had witnessed, they found that the story resisted simple telling. There was the groom who had stopped the ceremony, there was the man who had stood up, there was the bride who had walked out without running, who had set the veil on the altar with the specific deliberateness of someone putting down something she was finished carrying, who had left without looking back and without apology, and who had not, in any of the accounts that circulated in the weeks and months that followed, been described as sad, diminished, broken by it. The word that appeared most often in the stories told by the 200 people who had been sitting in white chairs on a morning in the Hanwha Grand Ceremonial Hall was simply gone. She was there, and then she was gone. And the man she was gone with had stood up for her in a room full of people who had not, and had offered her something that the room full of people had not, and she had taken it, which seemed to most of the people who told the story like the only reasonable conclusion. She had, in fact, taken it. She was taking it still. She was learning what it meant each day in small and significant increments to be in a life that had been chosen rather than arranged, to take up the space that had been offered, to stop folding herself into the margins of other people's stories, and to exist instead at the full dimensions of her own. It was not simple, it was not without its cost, but it was hers, which was the thing it had always needed to be, the thing she had not known until a man stood up from the third row of a ceremonial hall and crossed to an altar for her that she was allowed to require. She kept the dress. It was hanging now in the wardrobe of a room that was hers in a building that was his, which was a distinction that was becoming less and less meaningful as the months accumulated, as the space became familiar, as she stopped calculating the distance between herself and the exit and started simply being in the room. The dress hung there, and the morning light reached it and turned the ivory silk the particular gold of things that have been kept. And she saw it sometimes when she opened the wardrobe, and she thought about the fitting room mirror and the thought she had allowed herself that she looked like someone who belonged in beautiful things. She thought about that, and she thought about all the small and accumulating evidence of the months since, and she thought that the woman in the fitting room mirror had been right, had known something true before she had the full evidence for it. And that knowledge, the early knowledge before the proof, was the most important kind there was. She closed the wardrobe. She walked toward the sound of the morning, toward coffee and the particular quality of light in a room she was learning to call hers, toward a man who had told her he did not say things he did not mean, and had not, in all the time since, said a single thing he did not mean. She walked toward it the way you walk toward something you have stopped being afraid to want, without apology. Without apology at all.